Hi, my name is Jess and welcome to my channel, Jess and Romancelandia, where I talk about romance novels and happily ever afters and everything that will one day topple the patriarchy. I also feel like I say this at the start of every single video, but it's been a while. It's been a hot minute. Hi, how are we? I hope we're keeping well, hope we're keeping safe. I have fallen behind once more in my filming and uploading, and I am sorry, especially as you guys have been so amazing. I honestly can't believe that I've got nearly 1,000 subscribers now after a year of what has been very inconsistent posting from me. So thank you for your patience with my chaos. It is really appreciated. 2021 has been a really mad year for me personally. I've moved house 3 times, I've changed and moved to different cities twice, I've wrote a dissertation, I've finished a degree, I've started my first full-time job out of university, and it's just been mad. So my filming and uploading has kind of fallen by the wayside, but something that has remained consistent throughout is the reading that I've been doing. I feel like whenever my life gets really stressful and busy and chaotic, it's actually turning to a novel like a romance novel, like a bit of chick lit, like a bit of escapist fantasy even, that really helps me to kind of find my feet and calm down a bit, because those pages just feel so comforting and familiar when I know that everything is going to end okay. Because there are lots of books that I've been reading that I haven't had a chance to talk about on this channel yet that I'm going to talk to you guys about now, because it's time to film one of my favourite videos to film, which is my favourite books of the year. So this list is not ranked in terms of how much of a 5-star read each book was. I'm just going to go through them chronologically, so in the order that I read them this year, because that kind of makes for a nice little tour of my reading year as well as a reading year roundup. So let's just get in with the first book. So my first favourite of this year was quite an unexpected favourite for me, even though it's definitely a classic in the romance genre, and that is Sylvester by Georgette Heyer. Sylvester was a favourite that I didn't expect to be a favourite, because anyone that's heard of Georgette Heyer knows that she is, you know, very old school. She pretty much created the Regency romance subgenre today as we know it. So Sylvester follows the very grumpy Duke of Salford, Sylvester, who is told that he must marry, he must carry on his family line, he must do all those things that dukes in historical romance have to do to carry on their legacy. So at the start of this book, this charming old lady and his confidant, I can't quite remember how they're, you know, connected, but she's a woman that he trusts and that he looks up to and he respects, and she recommends her granddaughter, a young woman called Phoebe, to be his bride. However, Phoebe and Sylvester clash pretty much immediately, as she doesn't appreciate his cold, austere attitude at all, and some unsavoury rumours about his past lead her to take Sylvester, take his character, and write him into her novel, The Lost Heir, as a villain. This all then spirals wildly out of control as wider society gets hold of this book and starts to assume that the Sylvester caricature in the pages is the real life Sylvester. So the premise itself is really interesting, and the reason I was so drawn to it is because it's really similar to the plot of Band Sinister by KJ Charles, which is one of my favourite books of all time. And KJ Charles has said herself that that book in particular is a love song to some of the books that Georgette Heyer has written, particularly Sylvester and Venetia. So a large part of why I enjoyed this book is because for me I really got to see how it had planted so many of the seeds that we see cropping up now in today's Regency romances. So many of the tropes and the images and the character dynamics really reminded me of kind of prototypical versions of what you'd read today, and it just really felt like I was kind of reading this sort of intertextual, metatextual history of the Regency romance novel, which as a long-term fan of romance is something that I really enjoyed. So it was a really, really great book and I loved it, and it was a great way to kick off my reading year. My next favourite of the year literally takes us all the way from traditional Regency romance to amazing and fun contemporary romance, and that is Get a Life, Chloe Brown by Talia Hibbert. So this book follows a woman named Chloe who is a misanthropic web developer that has largely withdrawn from her social life and from the world around her since her chronic pain diagnosis, and she knows and is well aware that both her sisters and the friends that she has kept are quite worried that she's keeping herself cooped up and locked in. So Chloe decides to develop this Get a Life list, where she makes a list of things that she feels would constitute having a life, and she enlists the help of her flat superintendent, Redford Morgan, to help her in completing said list. This book was just so charming, and I think a large part of that was due to the characters. Both Chloe and Red are so well developed, and watching them go on their separate journeys and their journey together was so rewarding and had me just smiling the entire time. I also loved Chloe's family, her sisters who had their own books following on from Chloe's, and yeah, I just feel like Talia Hibbert created this perfect pocket-sized romance world that I just wanted to live in forever, really. The next book on my list is Unmasked by the Marquess by Cat Sebastian. So Unmasked by the Marquess is another Regency romance novel, but it's very different tonally from Sylvester, and it follows a character who decides to disguise themselves as their late employer, Robert Selby, for reasons that I'm not going to disclose because I don't want to spoil anything. Things get more complicated, however, when a prickly bisexual aristocrat named Alistair falls in love with the person that he thinks is Robert Selby. This is such a wonderful, wonderful romance novel, and it's a really interesting take on that kind of disguise narrative that you see quite often in romance novels. I think it's called the masquerade narrative, when a character, typically a character identified as a woman, disguises themselves as a man, and it's really a way in the plot for the author to get these two characters to spend a lot of one-on-one time together, when that might not necessarily be realistic otherwise, should it be a male character and a female character, especially in that time period. But Cat Sebastian really plays with that idea, and she says, okay, but what if we have a character who today would perhaps identify as non-binary or gender fluid? What happens then when for the first time in a very gendered society they're allowed to kind of flow between the two identities? And what happens then when this character has to negotiate a relationship whilst negotiating their own identity? It's just a really interesting and fun and lovely reflection on gender, on sexuality, on identity, told through the lens of a really great and diverse love story, and I absolutely adored it. I really love this trilogy. It's an entire trilogy called the Imposters Trilogy, and I would honestly recommend them all. But yes, Unmasked by the Marquess blew me away at the start of this year. The next book is another historical romance, and it's by KJ Charles, and it was her 2021 release, The Gentle Art of Fortune Hunting. If you guys have read any KJ Charles, this book is most similar to Band Sinister in that it's quite a fun, light-hearted Regency romance, but honestly, if you've picked up any of her books, you should try this one as well, because it is just KJ Charles at the top of her game. It follows twin siblings, Robin and Marianne, who enter a London season under the guise of being very wealthy members of society, when in reality they're fortune hunters, looking to marry a husband and a wife respectfully that can fund their lifestyle. Robin, for his part, sets his sights on Violet, the niece of a baronet turned brewer named Hart, who is the hero of our story. But Hart doesn't trust Robin at all and is convinced, and accurately convinced, that Robin is just after his niece for her money, so he sets about trying to expose Robin and his sister as the fortune hunters that they are. I think what I enjoyed so much about this book is it manages to be both a really fun, comical, romantic Regency romp, and a very biting deconstruction and takedown of London society and its prejudices and its hypocrisies. That kind of balance between just pure fun and like this subtle unravelling of social norms is something that KJ Charles does so well across all of her books, but this one in particular stood out to me. This book is also a great one if you guys haven't even read that much romance yet, as I passed it on to a friend of mine who just isn't a romance fan, and she absolutely loved it as well, and it was kind of all that we spoke about for a good week because we just both enjoyed it that much. The next book that I have to recommend to you is Indigo by Beverly Jenkins. This is another historical romance. It's been a good year for historical romance, but this one is set a bit later in the Victorian period, and it follows a young woman named Hester Wyatt who escaped from slavery and has since been volunteering with the Michigan Underground Railroad and trying to transport slaves safely to the north. One day Hester ends up taking in an injured man known as Black Daniel, who is a conductor on the Underground Railroad, and whilst the two initially butt heads, they slowly start to see each other in a new light, even as Black Daniel continues to hide some very essential secrets from Hester. Beverly Jenkins is an absolute icon when it comes to romance, and this was actually the first book of hers that I had ever read, and immediately I understood why she has this reputation. Okay, her books are impeccably researched, so romantic, and the characters have such great individual arcs as well as a romantic arc together. I absolutely loved Hester and her passion and her dedication and her sort of quiet but very powerful strength. And even though it took a while for Black Daniel to grow on me, given his quite brash and arrogant attitude at the beginning, ultimately I really enjoyed his transformation into a man worthy of Hester as well. This is a very difficult book to read in times as it does deal with slavery. Like I said, Hester was born into slavery, she was a former slave, and the prologue in particular deals with the very difficult decision that was made by her mother to try and keep her connected to Hester through the years. So if it's something that you think you might struggle to read, just, you know, be wary of that going in, but I 100% think it's worth it as it is just a beautiful and epic story. The next book on my list is also by Katia Rose because I'm nothing if not predictable, and it is Proper English. This book is set a little bit later than lots of her other stories. It's set in sort of Edwardian England, so turn of the century England, and it is the sequel to her other book, which I can't remember. Think of England. Think of England. You don't have to have read Think of England to read Proper English, but it does kind of give you a really interesting insight into the first book, as Proper English actually functions as a prequel of sorts. So Proper English follows a woman named Pat who is a no-nonsense sharpshooter on her way to the wedding of her childhood friend Jimmy Yoxall and society darling Fenella Caruth. Soon after Pat arrives, the tensions amongst the party culminate in a murder, and Pat and Fenella, also known as Fen, team up to uncover who is behind it, whilst also dealing with their changing feelings towards one another. This book is just the sapphic historical romance of my dreams. Everything about it is wonderful, from the world building to the mystery to the characters to just honestly everything about it was perfect. I absolutely love Pat and Fen, and I love how through their relationship Katia Rose also gets to kind of look at the gender stereotypes that we maybe internalise. So Fen is a very sort of chatty society darling who many view as airheaded, and Pat as well at the start of things views Fen much in the same way, albeit unintentionally, and the two of them end up throughout this novel kind of confronting their own internalised prejudices and growing to really respect one another, and the love story is built on that respect, which was just so beautiful. So if a queer historical romance with a side of murder and mystery appeals to you, definitely pick this one up. It's absolutely brilliant, even if the cover is a bit questionable. My next favourite of the year is An Extraordinary Union by Alyssa Cole. An Extraordinary Union is the story of Elle Burns, a former slave with a photographic memory who travels to the south of the United States to act as a spy, and she ends up reluctantly drawn in by another spy and a Scotsman named Malcolm. Should just clarify, Malcolm is both a spy and a Scotsman. There is not a separate spy and a separate Scotsman that Elle falls in love with. Sadly, this isn't a polyam romance because I think that Alyssa Cole would do such a good one. Anyways, now that's been said, this is a truly excellent book. Actually, it's more a novella than anything, but it is on the longer side of the novellas in my personal opinion. And even in that short amount of pages, Alyssa Cole manages to pack such a punch and such a truly romantic story. So yes, would highly recommend this one, and I'm definitely going to pick up some more Alyssa Cole in the new year. The next book was a hugely unexpected favourite of mine because I hadn't heard anything about it before I went in, and it is Solita by Lily Mayne, which is the first book in her Monstrous series. So the Monstrous series as a whole is sort of a post-apocalyptic paranormal series in which Earth is sort of overrun by various species of monsters, and some humans kind of are endeared to the monsters, but then you have the army who is intent on locking them up and experimenting on them, and the Monstrous series follows various monsters as they fall in love with various humans. I honestly wasn't expecting to like this book as much as I did because paranormal romances really tend to be a hit or miss with me, and I knew nothing about this one going into it, but I was absolutely blown away. And honestly, the fact that this is a debut novel, Lily Mayne, I'd bow down to Lily Mayne, honestly. So Solita in particular follows a human soldier named Danny who joined the army after feeling as though he'd lost everything. He had no family other than his mother, who recently passed away from cancer, so he joins the army kind of hoping to find a sense of community, and instead is really horrified by the experiments and fights that are waged against monsters. One monster in particular that the army wants to capture is known as the Solita because he can cause death just from his presence. But when Danny survives an encounter with the Solita, the two of them form a bond and ultimately decide to break away from the army and head out on their own. This book was so much fun. It was so vividly described. I could really picture the world and the creatures that Lily Mayne creates, and the romance between Danny and the Soul Eater, who we later find out is called Win, is so beautifully rendered. It develops slowly and is so just profound and beautiful and excellently written that I would read 100 books about them. The rest of the books in this series are also brilliant. Lily Mayne released a further 3 this year, which is insane for writing speed, and there is another one that is going to be released in February next year, so you've definitely got time to hop on this series now, and I 100% would. My next favourite of the year is another debut novel that I know blew so many of you guys away, and that is The Spanish Love Deception by Elena Armas. So this follows a woman named Catalina who is Spanish but working in an American office, and she's very stressed out when she finds out that her entire family is expecting her to bring an American boyfriend to her sister's wedding back in Spain. Catalina is very stressed out by the prospect of showing up single when her whole family expects her to be not single, but she is nonetheless surprised when her office enemy / rival, Aaron Blackford, offers to attend the wedding as her date and fake boyfriend. And as anyone who has read a romance novel or watched the film The Wedding Date will know, this fake dating plot inevitably develops into something more as the two of them start confronting their feelings for one another. The two things that really stood out for me with this book and made it a 5-star read were just how amazing the dialogue was and just how perfect Catalina's internal monologue was. The dialogue is so quick and snappy and clever, and each character has such a distinct voice that it read like a film. It honestly was so easy to visualize happening in front of me, even when I was just sat there reading it from my screen, and it makes this a very visual, fun, easy to fly through book. It's another one that's available on Kindle Unlimited, but I've also been seeing it in lots of bookshops lately, which is quite exciting because there aren't actually many romance sections in my local bookshops. So if you guys see it too in a Waterstones, that's where I've seen it recently, I would definitely say pick it up. The next book I have to recommend to you guys is Pick Me by May Archer. So this book is a spin-off of her previous series, the Whispering Key series, and it follows the youngest brother of 2 of the characters that we were introduced to in this previous series, and his name is Gage, and he's escaped from the Key where the previous books were set and has headed to Vermont to Sunday Orchard, where he has a job working on the orchard as kind of a stopover as he plans to move to a bigger city and get a job in a big tech company. Whilst there, he meets the 3 brothers that run the orchard, the Sunday brothers, and he falls for his grumpy boss, Knox Sunday, as the 2 of them end up sharing an office and a room. This book has so many beloved romance tropes in there. It's got your grumpy one versus your sunshine one, it's got your unique small town setting, it has forced proximity, it has mutual pining, and May Archer combines it all with such effortless humour and adorable character quirks, and it's just so easy to read and fly through. She has such a signature combination of kind of this hallmark cheese and heart with just some really clever, fun humour, and I would really recommend this book if you're looking for a pure, wholehearted escape from everything, because that's what it gave me. Next on my list is Catching Cradle by Katia Moore, which is a really fun FF sports romance set in a university. It follows Hope Hastings, who is part of the women's lacrosse team at her college, and this lacrosse team has a rule which basically says no fraternising with your teammates, no dating, no getting together, because it just messes with your game on the pitch. Hope is originally quite accepting of this rule, but when she develops a crush on her captain, Becca Moore, she doesn't know if she's going to be able to see it through till the end of the year. I love a sports romance. I especially love sports romances that are set in universities or colleges, because I feel like there's this really fun kind of new adult slash team sport camaraderie to them. That's something that this book definitely has plenty of. Everyone on the team is so supportive of one another, and their group dynamics are just as rewarding as the romantic dynamic that emerges between Hope and Becca. It was a tightly woven, brilliantly characterised romance, and I would highly recommend it to you. The final book on my list is actually books because it's a duology, which feels quite rogue. I feel like most romance series are trilogy length or longer, but the duology format worked really, really well for this one, and that is the Wed to the Barbarian duology by Kira Andrews. Kira Andrews is honestly one of my favourite authors, and she's such a shapeshifter as well. She writes romance mainly. I don't actually think she's written anything outside of but the kind of subgenres that she plays with across that is amazing. She's written fantasy romance, historical, contemporary, sports. She even wrote an Amish romance once, which I surprisingly loved. This book follows a young prince named Jem who is married off to Kador, a Viking-esque warrior from a northern land, and initially their marriage is quite fraught and quite stilted as Jem is transported to this land that he has no familiarity with, and Kador is very impatient with Jem's attempts to adapt. As time goes on, the two of them start to bond and respect one another, but political conflict is brewing on the horizon and starts to cause trouble for their newfound relationship and slowly growing love. If you guys have been watching my channel for a while, you might remember that Kira Andrews' Kidnapped by the Pirate ended up on my favourites list of last year, and this book kind of reminded me of that one, even though this is a fantasy and Kidnapped by the Pirates is a historical romance, because what they both have in common is that both of these books feel like such an ode to those lovely swashbuckling romances of old. The title of this book initially kind of had me doubting, as I imagine it did lots of romances, because the kind of barbarian romance, if you will, is a very old school trope that definitely has a lot of kind of dodgy things rooted in it. But what Kira Andrews really does with this is she undermines the notion of barbarian, and she kind of pokes fun whilst also playing homage to those traditional swashbuckling romances that so many of us grew up with, and so many of our mothers and grandmothers and other relatives grew up with. And she lets the readers in on the fun as well. Like, one detail that I absolutely loved with this book is that Jem is a reader, but the books that he particularly loves are kind of this fantasy land's equivalent of bodice rippers, and he spends lots of his time in this new northern land that he travels to thinking about what his favourite romance heroine would do in this situation, and he ultimately gets Kador to kind of play along with that as well, and it's just so fun as someone that has read romance and loved romance for so long. So yes, I would highly recommend this duology if you guys get the chance. It is both heartwarming and angsty, and the world building and character building is incredible, as is everything that Kira Andrews writes. So this was a great way to end my favourites of the year for me, and I hope that you guys enjoy it in 2022 as well. Okay, so those were my favourite books of 2021. It has been such a fun year of reading for me, and I hope that 2022 brings some more really great reads along the way. I already have a few books on my radar that I'm really excited about for 2022, so let me know if you guys would like me to do a 2022 anticipated releases video, because honestly I could go on about books that I'm waiting for all day long. I'd also really love to know what books you guys loved this year, so please do let me know down in the comments, because my 2022 TBR could always do with some pumping up, so it would be really great to see what you guys have read and loved this year. But until next time, thank you guys so much for watching, and goodbye!